Hi, I'm Meshal Malik and you're watching Indus Special. Our food systems are made in a way that they cater to our needs for having affordable and convenient options. But what does that mean for the environment? Let's discuss it with our panel of experts joining us today. We have with us Mr. Eduard, who's a founding member of the Ramini Center of Excellence in Sustainability, which aims to promote strong sustainability practices and research in Europe and abroad. He joins us from Iceland. Joining us today also from the United States in Virginia is Dr. Joanne Kong, who's a professor at the University of Richmond. She is one of the strongest advocates for plant-based nutrition today. Thank you both for joining us and a very, very warm welcome to the show. Dr. Joanne Kong, I'd like to begin with you. Now, there's two things that I've pointed out from my understanding of what really makes up this food system, which is affordability and then the convenience. Would you also say that it's those two factors that determine the food choices, the majority of the food choices we have today?
Yes, unfortunately, and this is the case throughout developing countries, including Pakistan and the United States, is that the idea of doing what is possible to make things easy for the consumer. You mentioned about the convenience of being able to access the food that's inexpensive. But behind that idea of convenient food, people don't realize the tremendous cost behind it. And it's not only a matter of personal health, because a lot of fast food, highly processed, high in fat, sugar, and salt, not only is it unhealthy for our bodies, but there's the tremendous, tremendous cost to the environment. Most of the food that one would find in a fast food place like McDonald's or KFC, Hardee's, those kinds of places, lots of processed food, lots of processed meat. And these foods require a lot of energy in order for those foods to be created. And a high meat diet comes with tremendous negative environment costs in terms of, just looking at greenhouse gases. The dietary greenhouse gas emissions from meat eaters is approximately twice as high as what you would find in a plant-based diet. Not to mention water pollution, the deforestation that's involved with feeding grain to the animals. There's other aspects such as the huge amount of packaging and plastics that are involved with making fast food available, styrofoam being the worst. I read somewhere it takes an unbelievable 900 years for styrofoam to break down in a landfill. Right. And then there's also transportation of distributing all of these foods. So there are a lot of aspects behind most consumers and the public is not aware of.
Right. Dr. Joanne Kong, from everything you've said, if I could just condense it a little bit, and I think what we're moving towards is trying to define or at least make a distinction between what is a sustainable diet and which diets are not sustainable. So if you could just very briefly, so that we're all on the same page, take us through the definition of perhaps a sustainable diet.
A sustainable diet is one that is using food as close to its natural state as possible. In other words, vegetables and fruits, whole grains, all of these foods that come out of the ground, so like one of the meals that I like to eat is simply making a huge salad with greens and throwing in maybe some brown rice or other nuts, that sort of thing. Eating food as close to its natural state as possible, staying away from overly processed foods that deplete our resources.
Right, great. Thank you for that. Stay with me. Eduard, just talking about everything that Dr. Joanne Kong mentioned and what I mentioned as well, that majority of our options are made up of factors that perhaps are convenient or affordable, all of that at one side. When we talk about the awareness, how much it is increased in regards to the environment, what we need to do to protect it, how much of our food options are sustainable today, do you think?
We don't really produce sustainably today. The global food production system that we have gives us seemingly cheap products, but at the cost of our health and at the cost of the environment. So you could look at the current global food production system as a shark loan. For instance, we get a cash deficit immediately taken, but then we have problems paying back at very high interest rates. And those interest rates are indeed extremely high. And if you cannot pay, there are consequences. For us, there are consequences on our health. And in this perspective, if we look at global rates, 11 million people die annually due to unhealthy diets. That's 20% of the total global mortality. And then we have problems dealing with an environmental and climate crisis. So the problem is that the system as is configured today is to give us a lot of cheap but really bad food.
Let me turn this conversation into how our psychology works when we deal with food. And Eduard, just your take on it. Why do you think humans find, other than affordability and access, find certain fast foods, junk foods so appealing?
I think first and foremost is the price and convenience of fast foods. And then, of course, we've had a media environment that's been promoting this for decades. And we see this propagating in industrializing regions too. You know, eating fast food is cool. And related to this, I was just reading about the potbelly myth that is something that a lot of industrializing countries have, whereas someone who has a belly is seen as well fed and in good health. However, the opposite is the case. And fast foods work exactly towards the same. Give us a lot of food, a lot of cheap food, a lot of tasty food.
Right.
Similarly tasty, it has detrimental effects to our health.
Right. I think we can all agree that the fast food we eat isn't good for our bodies. There is enough research to indicate that. But that point of media influence, I'm going to pick that up with Dr. Kong. Dr. Kong, consumerism, how much of a hindrance is that acting, a barrier is that acting for us to move towards sustainable diets?
It's definitely a barrier. It's not only the power of the 3 or 4 meat conglomerates that basically determine our food choices. They have such tremendous power in terms of just how they run as a business and also the influence they have upon governments. So that in a way, we have been conditioned to think, oh, this is the way things should be. And the tremendous advertising power of these companies are really making it easier for us to just think, oh, we need to be like everybody else. So there's that tremendous underlying pressure that those of us that are in the plant-based world were constantly working against. And to me, as an advocate, it's about empowering individual choice and for consumers to become more and more educated about what their food choices mean. One thing I'd also want to point out is that you look at fast food, which is high in a lot of sugar, salt, oil, and animal fat, and these are actually highly addictive. They trigger the release of dopamine, which is a neurotransmitter. And so you associate eating these products with, like this really feels great. This is something I want to keep doing. So also from a biological standpoint, that's one reason why people keep coming back to these foods, as Eduard mentioned, because, well, it tastes great because we have that positive reaction.
Right. Doctor, you mentioned here something that you're an advocate to empower people so they can make a different choice. You're an advocate of plant-based diets. What are the other reasons why you choose to be an advocate specifically for plant-based diets?
The reason I'm an advocate, growing up, I was like a lot of people. I consumed animals. And then I found out about what happens to animals in factory farms, the tremendous cruelty, the violence. It's the single most destructive and atrocious act of cruelty that's taking place on the planet today. So when my eyes were open to that this is what underlies what most people eat every day, I decided I could not be a part of that suffering, because I realized it goes against my innate compassion. And so I think everybody comes to plant-based nutrition for different reasons. And I think it's a combination of, it's not only good health, it's the environment and our resources. And for me, it was also the root reason of how I wanted to relate to other beings and to lessen their suffering.
Right. Eduard, as I hear Dr. Kong talk about her experience and other people talking about the various reasons why they don't go towards plant-based diets, one of the main reasons is that veganism, being a vegan, being a vegetarian, it's expensive. It's not really easy and accessible for everyone. Do you agree with that?
Yes, I think that's one of the problems. In some regions, like the United States, for instance, it can be very hard to procure fruits and vegetables. Other problems are related to the loss of fruits and vegetables along the supply chain, because those are highly perishable. And this is a lot to do with agriculture in industrializing regions. But then I would also argue that is customs and habits. And we, unfortunately, do have a very limited diet, and which we should diversify much more. Lancet report recently suggested that we should increase fruits and vegetables to half of our plate, while reducing a lot of the meat we're consuming and dairy products, also the processed food and sugars. But the problem here is that we've been raised in a certain way. A lot of us been raised eating a lot of meat, and then exploring new recipes, exploring new products, new ingredients. It's something out of our comfort zone.
Right. Not even out of comfort zone. I feel like there's a reckoning with culture and religion when you promote plant-based diets. And Dr. Kong, how do you deal with that as an advocate when you go to many different countries across the world advocating for this, not because of just, your personal beliefs, but the numerous benefits that are associated with it? How do you bring in culture and the religious aspects into the conversation?
When I speak with people, I always try to, first of all, find out where they're coming from in terms of their personal values. And when you look at all religions, isn't one thing that we have in common is to do no harm, right? To love one another, to show compassion to our fellow beings. And what more direct way can we do that than through our food choices, what we choose to put in our bodies? So I think it really comes down to connecting with people and asking what's important to you, taking care of your families, being healthy. I think that those values are things that are important regardless of what your religious direction might be. And during these times with the coronavirus, the focus has been put so much upon health. Because if you look at the effects of the typical fast food Western diet, those are the very diets that make COVID worse if you were to become infected. You look at heart disease, obesity, high blood pressure, diabetes, lung disease, all of those conditions are so closely tied to our dietary choices. So I think the challenges we're going through at this time is making us wake up not only to what diets do to our health, but also to our own individual personal choices of what's important to us in our lives.
Right. Dr. Kong, this is a question I put to a lot of guests when we are having this conversation about sustainability and especially our food choices, which is, with a growing population, we have so many other needs in our lives. Can we be sustainable with our diets, with our production, and still keep up with the amount of food that is needed in the world?
In fact, that is the challenge, is that a lot of people do not quite see that connection, that our current means of producing food is highly inefficient. For instance, it takes 16 times more land to produce the equivalent meat nutrition than growing plants. And the tremendous use of resources, of land, deforestation, habitat loss, pollution, all of these things. Food choices are intrinsically tied to our own sustainability because it ties in with what we're doing to the planet. So as climate change is getting worse and worse, I think people are starting to see those connections, that if we were to go, theoretically, if we were to go totally plant-based, we could save 70 to 80% of all the energy and land and water resources currently used towards meat production, and we could help to feed the growing population.
Right. And when we're making the shift, such a tremendous shift that will take place across the world in countries, and I'm talking about a hypothetical when and if here, but when we do that, will that not disrupt the food systems we already have in place? Will that not cause a multitude of other problems?
It depends how it is done. I mean, we are having the same debate in the great energy transition, how to transit from a fossil fuel-based society towards renewable energy. And the point here is that we need to transit, but how we'll do it will have a great impact on those who lead the change. And in our case, those are the farmers. So we need to make sure that the system is resilient to this change, because the system we have now is configured in a certain manner, a policy is directed in a certain manner, investment is directed in a certain manner, and so on and so forth. And this transition has to be done with care for those who carry out most of the tasks, which are the farmers. So we need to take care of the farmers, make sure that through this transition they're able to afford a decent livelihood. We need to make sure that investment is increasingly redivested towards sustainable farming practices. We need to make sure that there is education in the population, that people really see that a healthy food is everyone's business. And we need policies to not only tackle the food system per se, because the food system per se is not isolated. Right. These policies need to tackle poverty reduction and increasing the income of the poor in order so they can afford healthier food.
Right. There's so much that needs to be done in order for us to even imagine a world in which we rely more on sustainable agriculture, sustainable practices related to food. But we have to make that move. That urgency was underlined by Dr. Joanne Kong in our conversation today, and Eduard. Thank you both for joining us and talking to us, giving us your insight. We're going to go for a short break, but when we come back, we're going to have another discussion waiting for you, so stay with us. Welcome back. The world today observes the International Day of Peace. But in a world where we are seeing a record high number of internally displaced individuals due to violence and conflict, 80% of the UN humanitarian funding needs now being driven by conflict. What does peace mean today? Joining us for this conversation is Mr. Ramini, who's a Palestinian political analyst. He joins us from London. Also joining us today is Mr. David B. Larter, who is a naval warfare reporter with Defense News. He joins us from Washington, D.C. Thank you both for joining us, and a very, very warm welcome to the show. Jafar, I'd like to begin with you, and let's just get straight to it so we can dive into the conversation and debate. Is the world prioritizing peace?
Not at all. The world is prioritizing war and sales of arms. If I must just explain this rather stark statement. Look at my part of the world, the Middle East. There is something in America called the military-industrial complex, which is a beast with insatiable appetite. They spend billions of dollars in R&D. They spend further billions in production of armament and the up-to-the-date instruments of war, and they have to sell it. And the Middle East is a very ripe market. The Arab countries collectively spent about $180 billion last year on arms alone. And whom are they fighting? They are fighting amongst each other. There is a war in the Yemen. There is a war in Libya. There is a war in Syria. And they are paying through the nose, as per the instructions of Mr. Trump, to these armaments, which will only be allowed to use against each other. So no, there is no peace in the Middle East. Let me look at your neighborhood.
Jafar, stay with me. Jafar, with me, because I want to make sure that our conversation goes back and forth so we can have a holistic debate. David, is it because conflict is more profitable than peace that we continue to see the state of the world that we do?
You know, the state of the world, it's a good question, right? It becomes a chicken or the egg question, whether or not conflict comes about because of arms sales or if arms sales happen because of conflict. In some ways, if you look at it from the perspective of somebody who might make weapons, they all will talk in the sense of we're supplying a need to a customer, right? So if when people ask questions about why are you selling bombs, the answer always coming back is going to be, well, we're just meeting the needs of our customers, and ultimately that customer is the United States government, which approves the arms sale, and then the U.S. does sell arms everywhere. But
when this selling of arms, David, when this selling of arms creates a mess that we're seeing, one in which we are seeing more conflict and more violence than peace. Peace, which is supposed to be the ultimate goal, supposed to be the state in which everyone can strive, we can meet all our sustainable development goals. When we see that happening, is it just as you say, a circular argument?
I think it is a circular argument, because if we were still fighting with sticks and stones, the people that sharpen sticks and stones would be the ones making lots of money on selling sticks and stones to people that want to kill each other. And I know that's very simplistic, but that's honestly, I don't know how you look at it any other way. I mean, there's one way to say that, the industry is driving conflict. And sure, that's an interesting debate to have. But ultimately, no matter what we were using to kill each other, human beings are going to find a way to produce weapons that kill each other. Now, I think where we need to put pressure on our lawmakers and our leaders is creating policies that don't lead to us having to, or don't lead us to the armed conflict between states and armed conflict between groups. That's the pressure we can place. But I don't think we'll ever get away from providing weapons to people that want weapons to kill each other with.
Right. Jafar, David makes an interesting point here that it's not really the arms industry that we should be worried about. It's about people who make the decisions for conflict and violence to be spurred in the first place. Do you think that the arms lobby is aggravating the state of conflict in the world? I mean, to that point of what David has been saying.
Well, of course it is. As you said at the beginning, war is more profitable than peace. And if I may just say to our friends in the United States, look at your foreign aid to countries like Jordan, Egypt, and Israel. It's all in military equipment. These equipments have to be sold. And to say that somebody else will provide it and to talk about stick and stones, I'm afraid, with respect, it's a little bit cynical. We have now technology that people sitting in Texas will bomb Lahore and Jerusalem and Cairo, whatever. So there's got to be a little bit of morality in politics. Otherwise, it's the law of the jungle, and might makes right. It doesn't. The United States of America should become to look inward and say, what are we doing to the world? And to ask themselves a simple question, which I'm always confronted with. Why are the people hate us so much? It's because you perpetuate wars. Look at the war in Iraq. It was all built on a lie. They destroyed Iraq. They killed over 1 million Iraqis. 20 million Iraqis are scattered all over the world, and there is an ongoing sectarian war. And that is because of the lies of the United States of America. Look at the conflict they are trying to create with Iran. Iran signed a deal. The whole world agreed to it, including Mr. Obama. Then Mr. Trump came and canceled it. Why? Because Israel demanded it. To have peace, you've got to be honest with yourself and your neighbor.
Right. David, Mr. Jafar, I want to talk about the role that international governments are playing in trying to aggravate conflict and bringing about conflict and doing so with impunity. But David, to your earlier point, I do have another question, which is, if your perspective is that, arms sales is not really the driving force of conflict, can we at least appreciate and can we at least talk about how technology has changed the nature of this conflict, made it worse?
I do think that I think the world is, from an arms sales perspective, I think the world is at a very dangerous inflection point. If you'll recall the latest standoff between the U.S. and Iran over what the United States sees as Iran's malign activities in the region, which is funding groups that oppose U.S. interests. I mean, if we get right down to it, in Iraq and in the region, that came to a head with the assassination of Qasem Soleimani and the subsequent retaliation of Iran against U.S. bases or U.S. troops based in Iraq. And I think what we saw there was Iran's capability to, at a very long range, pinpoint and with relative pinpoint accuracy, hit targets in Iraq from long distances. And I think when we look at the state of the world and we talk about peace, I think that's where the world is becoming very dangerous. If you remember in the Cold War, the big threat was nuclear missile exchanges, right? Well, the whole world will end because the U.S. and the Soviet Union will exchange missiles over very long ranges and be able to kill lots and lots of people. And that was an enormous threat. And in some ways, people will argue that the parity between the U.S. and Russia kept a kind of stability in the world that kept peace between the major powers because we both had the ability to kill each other. The technology with conventional weapons in conventional strike hitting targets over long distances, that is destabilizing, and it changes the nature of conflict because Iran is able to develop that in-house in concert with others, but largely develop that stuff in-house. And North Korea has developed those capabilities. China's developed robust capability in that regard. So I think in terms of where weapons sales are going, this sort of long-range strike is highly destabilizing. It used to just be the United States that could do it, and it's not the case anymore.
Right. I take point there, and thank you so much, David B. Larter, for joining us and giving us your insight. Jafar, to everything that David talked about here, what's your thoughts? What are your thoughts?
Well, the thing is, what I find very sad, he's a young American, and they will never take blame for what they do to the world. I mean, it's not only armed conflict. Look at Mr. Trump is starting an economical war with China and the world. That's another form of war which is not conducive with peace. America must understand that other peoples in the world have rights as well, and they should not kneel in front of American power. It's a give and take. When we understand each other, and we exchange ideas, we can reach peace. But when we are dictated to, nobody likes to be dictated to. And the United States of America, especially Congress, must understand that the lobbies that pressure them to pass laws and bylaws are not innocent. To be an innocent broker of peace, you've got to be impartial. And these people are interested in profit. They don't care about people's lives. I know the United States of America did not start these wars, but they have huge influence. If they want to end it, they can end it. At the contrary,
Jafar, if I could just interject here. Often when we talk about conflicts and when we talk about them in isolation, the impression that goes off, or perhaps the impact of that, is that there's a lot of conflict fatigue. People are tired of hearing it because it doesn't seem to concern them. So here's where I want to make the conversation global and ask you, through this pandemic, we've seen how connected the world is. So when we see these conflicts, when we see, for example, in Gaza, where there's only 5% of clean drinking water, so much of the population is under the poverty line, all these things happening, how do these conflicts impact the world in totality?
Well, they impact the whole world because, as you just said, we live in a global village. What happens in Lahore now, people are listening to all over the world. And I'm here to tell you, especially in the Middle East and specifically in Gaza, because this war and this, if you like, strangulation of Gaza is financed by the United States of America. They give arms to Israel. They give political cover to Israel. They give to Israel every wish they want with interest. I must say something. There was a video last week in Tel Aviv, in the airport, when this lady, born in America, an American citizen with an American passport, arrived at Tel Aviv airport for a visit. She is of Palestinian origin, of course. She was treated like a slave, and she was told she cannot come in. And when she said that she's an American citizen and she's entitled and she's got a visa, he said, no, this is not America, go back to America. And she said to him, we paid for this airport, which is true, through our taxes. He said, then go back and don't pay taxes. This is what America is perpetuating: conflict, occupation, and suppression of people. And what really makes me angry is the way they keep saying our way of life and our morality and our standards. What standards? Standards don't come at the point of a gun.
On that point, thank you so much, Mr. Jafar Ramini, for joining us from London. I'd also like to introduce another guest who's joined us, Dr. Saravanamuttu, who is the founder and executive director of the Center for Policy Alternatives. He joins us from Colombo. Thank you so much for joining us and welcome to the show. We've been talking a lot about the state of peace in the world. We've been talking about, as Mr. Jafar Ramini stated, the law of the jungle, it seems to prevail. When we see that there is impunity for international actors to act the way they do, how does that impact domestic politics, domestic affairs, especially governments who then feel like that gives them an excuse to continue violence and conflict within their borders?
Well, absolutely. I mean, what that does, of course, it gives the dictators, the autocrats, because they know that the people who they are acting against in terms of domestically do not have any friends outside or powerful enough friends outside to put any pressure to change their behavior. So this is why we have to make sure that international civil society is strong, that domestic dissent, etc., finds the self-confidence and the resilience to continue to put up a show against dictatorship and intolerance. And hopefully that will, after a time, have its residences internationally, and an international coalition too won't feel weak and cave in. Of course, an international coalition that one talks about is also based on states, and the states have their interests, and we need to take them into account. We can't be naive in assuming that the international community will see things in black and white terms. No, international politics is always relatively gray, but we have to persist and ensure that they see things more our way than they do of the autocrats and the dictators.
Dr. Saravanamuttu, as you talk about this need for the international community to perhaps grow teeth, have power to do something, we don't see that happening. And I'm not sure if for the future we can be optimistic that that will happen either.
Well, I would say that the natural flights of the human mind are from hope to hope rather than cynicism. I mean, the world has changed. Surely it has changed over the last 50 years, over the last 25 years. We have to persist in doing that. And remember that at times at which the great dictators, the autocrats, etc., seem to be at their strongest, they probably are at their most weakest. You know, for example, what is happening in the world today with a rise of populist nationalism and all of that, this is a backlash, obviously, against globalization. But is it going to succeed? Let us see.
But until we see anything happen in the United Nations Security Council, we don't see a change come about there. Can we expect that there will ever be any meaningful international intervention?
Well, the issue with regard to international intervention is this, is that, look, the United Nations was set up according to a particular balance of power in 1945. There are nuclear states in the world. Does the rest of the world want to go to war with a nuclear state? Isn't that what the Security Council and the veto were created for? To act as a fuse if anyone tried to go to war against a nuclear state. So what we have to recognize is that the United Nations has to try to reconcile the power of the strong with the consent and legitimacy of the weak. And that is a continuous work in being. So, yes, we have to take account of the changed world and enlarge the Security Council. Some states perhaps don't need to be on the Security Council anymore. Yeah. And we need to therefore look into the ways in which we can reform the mechanics and the architecture of the international system. But remember, politics is about power. Power is about a hierarchy, and that will always be there. And with that will always go the forces of dissent against it.
I'm going to put this question to you, very early on into our segment here, which was, is the world even prioritizing peace at this point? And as I say this, I'm just going to put this other question to it as well, which is there even a pretense of prioritizing peace at this point?
First of all, I think forgive me, I will throw the question back to you in the sense of what do you mean by peace? What does peace mean?
When we see continuous displacement in the world, when we see more violence acts, when we see conflict being more profitable than peace, is there any need to try to counter all of this?
Yes, and absolutely. I mean, the thing about peace is this. Peace at the end of the day cannot just be the absence of war. It's not about the guns falling silent. It is also about going to the root causes of conflict which have led to violence and death and destruction, and trying to ensure that they are no longer sustainable and they're no longer reproducible. And that, I think, is a continuing challenge. We really need to look at ways, I mean, technology will assist us and all of that. When you ask me, has the world prioritized peace? No, I suppose the answer is that you don't prioritize peace. You prioritize, in terms of international politics, interests. And when those interests come to recognize that, the best way of pursuing them is not through war, it's not through conflict, but through coexistence. Then we will have arrived at our utopia.
Right. I'm going to introduce another guest who's joined us, Professor Phil Clark, who's a professor of international politics and the co-director of the Center on Conflict, Rights and Justice at the SOAS University. His latest book, Distant Justice, The Impact of the International Criminal Court on African Politics, has just been released. He joins us from London. Thank you so much, Professor Phil Clark, for joining us, and welcome to the show. Now, what cost is all of this coming at when we're seeing so much conflict, the human cost of it? Because I think it's important to reiterate that these aren't just, big economic players in the realm. There are also people and lives at stake that we continue to see being lost, lives being lost, homes being lost. What is the humanitarian crisis that we're seeing when countries do not put peace on the docket?
I think you're absolutely right that there's a danger in only seeing conflict in economic terms and only talking about the economic toll. We often forget the impact of mass violence on individuals, on families, and on communities. I do a lot of my fieldwork in Central Africa, places like Rwanda, which obviously had a genocide against the Tutsi in 1994. I do a lot of work in Burundi, in the Democratic Republic of Congo, and also in Uganda. And one of the deep legacies of mass violence in those countries is the trauma, the psychological trauma that is done to people, the psychological damage that individuals and families then live with, often for generations. And also, history tells us that conflict tends to create grievances, whether it's between religious groups or ethnic groups or between different countries. And those grievances can then become the seeds of future violence. And I think that's one of the things that we have to bear in mind when we think about peace, that if we don't achieve peace in the immediate, those grievances can fester, and we can often find that we're back in the same places in the future, trying to bring peace once again. There is often a compounding dimension to violence. There's often a cyclical dimension to violence. And our understanding of peace, I think, has to also grapple with that.
Dr. Saravanamuttu made this interesting point, which was that we shouldn't be prioritizing peace, but there needs to be a prioritization of international interests. Professor Phil Clark, how do you take that?
I think that's absolutely right, that when we're thinking about peace, we also have to think about power, that most of the major conflicts around the world today have these very important power dimensions. If we think of places like Syria, if we think of places like Congo, Somalia, Myanmar, these are places where very powerful actors are often some of the key drivers of conflict. And I think one of the real challenges for peace today is that many people put their faith in the so-called international community to achieve peace. They think of the United Nations, they think of peacekeeping missions in bringing peace. But it's often the very powerful members of those international bodies, for example, the permanent members of the Security Council, who are some of the key reasons why we have so much conflict. You look at the permanent members of the Security Council, the US, Russia, China, the UK, France. All of these big, powerful states are driving conflict in the Middle East, in parts of Africa, and further afield. It's the interests of those powerful states, often the same states that we think can bring peace, that we actually have to grapple with. It's the interests of those powerful states that are often fueling violence, fueling conflict. And so this means we also need to tackle the interests of those very powerful states if peace is going to be achieved.
How do we, I know this is a very large question, but where we stand today, and I continuously say this, that we're seeing so many lives lost, we're seeing so much displacement, we're seeing so much destruction, we're seeing so much hunger, we're seeing all of this rise. When we stand in the world today and try to figure out what state of peace exists, how we can move towards it. As you say, we need to reckon with the interests of these powerful countries that are responsible for all this conflict. How does that happen? Who holds them accountable? Who reckons with their interests?
I think that reckoning, that accountability really operates at two levels. One is that other states have to put pressure on those powerful actors to start to change their interests and to start to change their actions. Within the UN system, there's a huge role for the General Assembly to play, and that General Assembly involves all the states of the world, putting various forms of diplomatic, economic, and other pressure on members of the Security Council. One of the ways that has happened in the past is that some of those members of the General Assembly have said to the Security Council, we will not participate in many of your own UN multilateral missions unless you change your behavior on the battleground. members of the General Assembly have said we will pull our troops out of UN peacekeeping missions if we don't start to see the permanent members of the Security Council changing their ways. So other states can play a very important role in changing the incentives of the permanent members of the Security Council. But the second level is at the community level, everyday people. And I think your previous guest mentioned this, that much conflict is also driven by factors at the local level. It's about what happens between clans. It's about what happens between communities. And there's a huge amount of important peace and reconciliation work being done all around the world at that level. That's sometimes about communities saying, we don't trust the big powers to have our interests at heart. We don't trust the UN to do an effective job when it comes to peace, so we're going to do it ourselves. And we're seeing this in places like Eastern Congo, in Sri Lanka, in Myanmar, in South Sudan, where there's often been a real failure of international peacekeeping and international diplomacy, but the real work of peace in many of those places is being done by everyday citizens who aren't just simply sitting around waiting for some kind of international miracle to happen.
When we're seeing spaces for dissent shrinking, what power does civil society have in that case, and what can we expect to happen in the future if those spaces continue to shrink?
There's no doubt that it's becoming harder for civil society actors all around the world to try to deal with mass conflict, usually because of the actions of their own governments. We're seeing very authoritarian states cracking down on local media, on local community groups, on religious groups, disrupting the work that they otherwise would have done in the peace space. But again, coming back to the Central African countries where I do much of my work, I think what's remarkable is that even in the face of that government activity, that government opposition, community groups are still working incredibly hard, often with substantial effect, to try to deal with the conflicts that have happened in those particular places. These are civil society groups that have dealt with authoritarian governments for decades. It's not new to them. And what's interesting is that they're always having to find creative ways to get around the state. The other advantage that in Central Africa that many of these civil society groups have is that they really know the local terrain. They know the local actors. They know the local drivers of conflict. And they often have a very good sense of the kind of mediation and reconciliation efforts that are necessary to achieve peace. They really know that local context in a way that the government doesn't always know and the international community doesn't always understand. And so there is still, I think, some real hope for civil society and community-based actors because of that local knowledge that they possess.
Well, thank you for giving us that hopeful bit to end on in what seemed like an otherwise very, very grim conversation. Thank you so much, Professor Phil Clark, for joining us from London, Dr. P. Saravanamuttu for joining us from Colombo. We're going to end the show there. Thank you for staying tuned with us. We will see you tomorrow with more stories. Till then, goodbye and take care.